It began on a wet October evening when the Fletcher family arrived at Hawthorne Manor, a sprawling, isolated estate in the Dorset countryside. Sarah Fletcher, a 32-year-old schoolteacher, clutched the hands of her children, Emily and Joshua, as they stepped out of the cab. Her husband, Mark, a 35-year-old history professor, adjusted his scarf and surveyed the property with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. The manor had been abandoned for nearly 50 years. Its windows were boarded, the stone walls coated in moss, and the gardens choked with overgrown brambles. The locals spoke little of it, but those who did whispered of strange events, unexplained deaths, and a family that had vanished mysteriously over a century ago. For the Fletchers, however, it seemed like a perfect escape from the noise of London, a quiet place to raise their children, free from the chaos of urban life. Yet from the first night something felt off. The air inside the manor was frigid, far colder than the heating system could account for. Shadows flickered at the corners of Sarah's eyes, and Emily, her 6-year-old daughter, whispered of a lady in white who watched her from the hallway. Mark, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as a child's imagination adjusting to a new environment. But when their dog, Baxter, refused to enter the east wing of the house, growling lowly at something invisible, Mark could not ignore the creeping sense of unease that began to infiltrate him. The first few nights were punctuated by small disturbances, soft creaking floors, whispers that seemed too faint to identify, and objects slightly displaced from their original positions. Emily began drawing strange pictures of a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes and elongated fingers, while Joshua, once cheerful, started speaking to invisible entities in his room. Sarah tried to comfort him, insisting it was imaginary friends, but an inexplicable chill accompanied his utterances, as though unseen eyes were watching her every reaction. On the third evening, Mark discovered something unusual while unpacking the library. Behind a false panel in the wall, he found a small journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages inside were yellowed, the handwriting delicate yet urgent. It belonged to Eleanor Hawthorne, a young woman who had lived in the manor during the late 1800s. Her entries detailed a life overshadowed by dread. She wrote of voices calling her to the attic, of shadows that moved independently of the light, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. The final entry ended abruptly. "It knows I see it. It watches from the walls. If anyone reads this, do not. The page trailed off mid-sentence, as if interrupted. By the end of the first week, the manor had begun to assert its presence more aggressively. Doors slammed shut without warning. Footsteps echoed along empty corridors. Objects flew across rooms without cause. Emily became withdrawn, refusing to enter certain areas of the house. Joshua refused to sleep alone. Even Mark, the rational historian, began to feel the manor's oppressive weight, as if it were a living entity, observing, waiting, and learning from the family's patterns. The local villagers, when approached, were wary. A retired constable spoke of children who had seen things in the house generations ago, of sounds that could not be explained, and of a shadow lady who had been glimpsed peering from the upstairs windows. One historian recounted how the Hawthorne family, the original occupants, had practiced rituals of unknown origin, attempting to bind spirits within the walls of the manor. The thought that the Fletcher family might be living within such a place filled Mark with both fascination and dread. One particularly stormy night, the temperature inside the manor dropped precipitously. Sarah awoke to the sensation of a cold hand resting on her shoulder. She turned quickly, but no one was there. She shook Mark awake, and he revealed he had felt the same pressure moments before, accompanied by a whisper in his ear. That same evening, Emily screamed from her room. Rushing to her side, Sarah found the child pointing at the far corner of the room. There, emerging from shadows, was the figure of a woman in tattered white, pale and hollow-eyed. Emily whispered, "She's here. She's watching us." The Fletcher family attempted to rationalize the experience, but the occurrences only escalated. By the second week, the house seemed alive, groaning and creaking in ways that did not correspond to wind or settling wood. Shadows moved with a deliberate intelligence, and the whispering voices grew louder, forming words that Mark could barely discern. Objects would move across rooms in full view. Doors would slam shut as if guided by unseen hands, and the temperature fluctuated violently, plunging rooms into freezing cold and then back into stifling warmth within minutes. Desperate, the Fletchers sought outside help. Dr. Thomas Weaver, a well-known paranormal investigator, was called in. He set up cameras, motion sensors, and audio recording devices throughout the house. Within hours, the equipment picked up disturbing anomalies: orbs of light moving through walls, shadowy figures appearing in hallways, and most chillingly, the disembodied voice of Eleanor Hawthorne speaking through static-laden audio. "Do not stay. Do not stay. Leave while you can." The children's behavior changed dramatically. Emily drew increasingly grotesque images of the tall, dark figure, often depicting it holding Joshua or hovering over her parents. Joshua began to speak to the entities as though they were real companions, telling them secrets no one else could hear. Nights became unbearable, filled with screaming, flying objects, and inexplicable cold that settled on their skin like ice. Mark, despite his academic background, began to believe that the manor itself was sentient, feeding on fear and growing stronger with each passing night. The third week brought a new level of dread. The Fletcher family could no longer ignore the intensity of the supernatural activity. Every day, objects shifted without explanation, and the children's drawings became progressively darker, filled with distorted figures that seemed to anticipate events before they occurred. Emily had begun to speak of a shadow man she called the Watcher, describing how he lingered near the corners of her room, observing silently, yet always present. Joshua claimed to hear whispers instructing him to follow the lady, gestures and motions that he made toward empty corners, leaving Sarah and Mark questioning their own sanity. One evening, Mark attempted to confront the phenomena logically. He set up additional cameras in the hallways and the children's rooms, hopping to capture evidence of ordinary explanations, settling floorboards, reflections, or drafts. Instead, he found something far more disturbing. The footage showed shadows moving independently, bending around corners, lingering at angles impossible for ordinary objects. In one frame, a tall, thin figure appeared behind Emily as she slept, standing motionless for over 10 minutes before fading into the darkness. Mark's initial skepticism faltered. There was no logical explanation. Sarah's experiences grew increasingly personal. While walking through the manor's long, narrow corridors, she frequently felt cold fingers brush her arms, though no one was near. At night, she awoke to whispers calling her name from empty rooms. On more than one occasion, she reported seeing fleeting images of a woman in white watching her silently before vanishing. The air would drop in temperature, and she felt an oppressive weight, as though the house itself pressed against her, trying to communicate a warning she could not fully understand. By this point, the family's attempts to continue a normal routine had failed. Meals were eaten quickly, often in silence, as shadows moved across walls and ceilings. Sleep became a rare commodity, disrupted by Emily's screams or Joshua's conversations with unseen entities. The dog, Baxter, no longer ventured beyond the main living areas, often growling toward the empty staircase or retreating under the dining table. The Fletcher family began keeping the lights on continuously, but the dark corners remained impervious to illumination. The escalation reached its peak one night when Sarah was alone in the library, cataloging some old books that had been left in the manor. A sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing the fireplace. She turned to see a figure standing by the large window, Eleanor Hawthorne herself, her white gown torn and ragged, eyes hollow yet piercing. Sarah froze, unable to speak or move. The ghost raised one hand slowly, pointing toward the attic. A voice, layered and dissonant, echoed through the library. "Do not ignore it. Do not ignore what lies above." Terrified, Sarah called Mark, who had been inspecting the east wing. Together, they approached the attic cautiously, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The temperature dropped further as they ascended, the air thick and almost tangible, pressing against their lungs. Inside, the walls were lined with strange symbols, etched in a manner that suggested ritualistic purpose. Candles, long extinguished, had left blackened wax drippings that formed unsettling patterns on the floor. The atmosphere was heavy, with a presence that defied description, something that had waited decades in silence. Emily and Joshua were brought to the attic reluctantly, but upon entering, they immediately reacted as if sensing the manor's intent. Emily clung to Sarah's leg, whispering to the unseen, "I can see her, she's angry." Joshua's small voice directed itself at a shadow in the corner, telling it to leave his family alone. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, an unseen force testing their courage. In that moment, Mark finally admitted to himself that the manor's history was not merely tragic. It was alive, a sentient place that remembered its past and exacted its presence on anyone who entered. Seeking external help became imperative. Dr. Thomas Weaver arrived the following day with an array of devices meant to capture supernatural activity. The equipment registered temperature drops, electromagnetic disturbances, and visual anomalies invisible to the naked eye. One of the cameras recorded a figure that appeared to follow Dr. Weaver as he moved through the hallways, vanishing when he turned directly toward it. Audio devices picked up fragmented voices speaking in what appeared to be Eleanor's voice, repeating warnings and fragments of her journal entries. Despite these measures, the Fletchers could not escape the house's influence. Sleep deprivation and fear began to erode their resolve. Shadows in the hallways stretched and contorted, sometimes forming shapes that resembled the children. The sound of footsteps, whispers, and piano notes in discordant keys became almost constant. The family's emotional state deteriorated as isolation, fear, and helplessness combined. One evening, the tension culminated in an incident that would haunt the family forever. Sarah awoke to a loud crash from the living room. Rushing in, she found furniture overturned and objects suspended midair. Emily and Joshua cowered in the corner, muttering about the shadow man's approach. Mark entered moments later, witnessing a figure that appeared partially transparent, gliding across the room, its face a hollow mask of sorrow and rage. The figure stopped in front of him, raised a hand, and whispered a single word, "Leave." At that moment, Sarah realized the manor had been waiting for them all along, observing, testing, and now issuing its final warning. Desperate, the family began packing their belongings immediately. Even as they moved through the house, objects flew past them, doors slammed, and a cold wind blew through rooms with no openings. As they reached the main entrance, the final voices echoed in the air, whispers from multiple sources overlapping. "You cannot leave, not truly, you belong." The Fletchers fled into the night, never to return. Hawthorne Manor remains abandoned to this day, its windows staring like empty eyes across the overgrown gardens. Locals avoid it, and those who peer inside report shadows moving through the halls. Some claim they see a tall figure in white, staring from the upper windows, eternally waiting for the next family to enter its walls. Emily continues to draw figures resembling the Shadow Man, and Joshua occasionally wakes screaming, recounting conversations with a presence only he can see. Researchers visiting the manor have reported chills, whispers, and the unshakable feeling of being watched, confirming that Hawthorne Manor is not merely a building but a living entity, one that remembers, observes, and waits. The fourth week in Hawthorne Manor brought a crescendo of supernatural activity that left the Fletcher family in constant fear for their lives. Even during the daytime, the shadows seemed to linger longer than light could reach, moving independently and forming shapes that resembled the long-dead inhabitants of the house. Sarah began noticing whispers following her wherever she went, words in fragmented English and archaic tones, warning of dangers and recounting events from the manor's dark past. She started keeping a notebook, documenting the incidents in painstaking detail, hoping to preserve proof that would explain to anyone who doubted them what the house had become. Mark, though a historian, began to feel powerless. His logical approach had failed entirely. The patterns in the hauntings seemed intelligent. The shadowy figures moved not just through rooms, but as if anticipating his steps. When he examined old records from local archives, he discovered that the Hawthorne family, dating back to the early 1800s, had been obsessed with binding spirits to the manor through rituals involving meditation, ceremonial symbols, and prolonged isolation. Several children of the Hawthorne lineage reportedly vanished under mysterious circumstances, their disappearances tied directly to these rituals. It became apparent that Eleanor Hawthorne had been attempting to protect the house's secrets, or perhaps had been consumed by them. Emily's drawings became increasingly grotesque, portraying multiple figures, some vaguely human, some monstrous, with long shadows stretching across walls. She spoke to them as if they were friends, asking their intentions and learning their rules. Joshua, once playful and innocent, had become withdrawn, often speaking to invisible entities with urgency and fear. He told Sarah one morning that the Shadow Man does like it when we move things, and that he waits in the attic for the lady. The children's clarity about the spirits was unsettling. It was as though they were attuned to forces adults could barely perceive. Sarah and Mark attempted to escape, even temporarily, by sleeping in a local inn, but they returned each morning to find subtle disturbances. Furniture shifted slightly, drawings by Emily in their rooms, faint whispers that followed them into the hallways. The manor seemed to track their movements, as if denying them reprieve even outside its walls. One night during a particularly violent storm, the full manifestation occurred. The lights flickered out completely. A freezing wind swept through the manor, extinguishing the few candles they had managed to keep lit. Shadows coalesced in every corner, forming figures that whispered in unison, "You cannot leave, the house remembers, the house waits." Sarah clutched Emily and Joshua, huddling together as objects lifted into the air. Chairs spun violently, doors slammed, and the temperature dropped to near freezing in seconds. Baxter barked uncontrollably, retreating under the staircase, his body trembling as if sensing some ancient malevolence. In the chaos, Eleanor Hawthorne appeared fully visible, her white gown torn and soiled, eyes hollow yet infinitely expressive of sorrow and rage. She moved through the room silently, pointing to symbols drawn in black on the walls and floor. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with energy. Sarah realized that a leaner spirit had been attempting to communicate, to warn them of something hidden within the manor's deepest chamber, the very heart of its malevolent power. Driven by desperation, Mark ventured to the attic while Sarah held the children in the living room. The staircase groaned beneath his weight, yet he felt no comfort in the familiar structure. The steps seemed endless. In the attic, the walls were lined with shelves of old books, journals, and artifacts. The air carried a pungent scent of decay, mixed with the faint metallic smell of blood. In the center of the room was a faded symbol, etched into the floor with precision and care. As Mark examined it, the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, and whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. Suddenly, the room seemed to expand, stretching impossibly in all directions. Shadows elongated, coalescing into a mass of forms, writhing and contorting. Aliner's voice echoed through the chamber. "The house remembers, the house binds. You cannot leave until the debt is paid." Mark's heart pounded as he realized the manor was sentient, feeding on fear, memories, and perhaps the souls of those trapped within its walls. Desperate to survive, Mark recited passages from Aliner's journal aloud, attempting to recreate her warnings and rituals. The air seemed to resist him, pressing against his chest and making it difficult to breathe. Outside the attic, Sarah witnessed the shadows in the hallway coalescing into human forms, reenacting past tragedies of the Hawthorne family. Figures appeared as if frozen in time, children crying, servants fleeing, and Alina herself standing amidst them, trapped by the house's invisible grip. Hours passed in a blur of terror. Objects crashed, shadows surged, and the children wailed. As dawn approached, the manor seemed to pause, releasing a collective breath. The house returned to silence, yet the oppressive weight remained. Sarah and Mark, physically exhausted and mentally shattered, packed their belongings and fled as quickly as possible, carrying Emily and Joshua in their arms. They did not stop until they reached the main road, where the first rays of sunlight provided a fragile sense of safety. The Fletcher family never returned to Hawthorne Manor. Locals confirm that the house stands abandoned, windows staring like eyes, its gardens overgrown, waiting for the next unsuspecting family. Researchers who attempted to investigate report inexplicable temperature drops, sounds of whispers, fleeting shadows, and the sensation of being watched. Some claim they have glimpsed the figure of Alina Hawthorne, pale and ragged, her eyes fixed on those who approach the house, silently warning them to leave before the manor claims their sanity. Emily continues to draw the figure she witnessed, now aged but still vivid in her imagination. Joshua sometimes awakens screaming, recounting conversations with unseen presences. Sarah and Mark, despite relocating, are haunted by nightmares and a persistent feeling of eyes following them, reminding them that Hawthorne Manor does not forget, does not forgive, and never releases those it has marked. As the Fletchers struggled to comprehend the terrifying events of the attic, Dr. Thomas Weaver returned to the manor to conduct a more thorough investigation. He spent hours poring over historical records, diaries, and journals preserved in the local archives, piecing together the lineage of the Hawthorne family. What he discovered was chilling. The family had been obsessed with controlling life and death, conducting occult rituals designed to bind spirits to the manor's walls. Each generation attempted to harness supernatural forces, but the results were always catastrophic. Children disappeared, servants vanished, and the family itself seemed cursed, trapped within cycles of fear, death, and supernatural influence. Sarah and Mark learned that Alina Hawthorne had been attempting to break the cycle. Her journals described attempts to appease the spirits and seal away darker entities, but she had been unsuccessful. The house, it seemed, had developed its own intelligence over the decades. It remembered each attempt, each ritual, each family that lived within its walls. It learned how to manipulate fear, how to influence the minds of the living, and how to trap souls within the mansion indefinitely. Meanwhile, the children's interactions with the supernatural grew more intense. Emily began speaking in voices that were not her own, reciting fragments of Alina's journal entries verbatim. She claimed that the spirits had taught her the manor's rules, warning her that any misstep could invoke the wrath of the Shadow Man. Joshua began to act as a mediator, guiding unseen entities and negotiating for the family's safety in a language the adults could not understand. Their abilities were a mixture of clairvoyance and instinct, a terrifying combination that highlighted just how entwined they had become with the manor's consciousness. The manor itself escalated its hauntings. Doors no longer simply slammed. They became portals, opening to impossible spaces and revealing glimpses of past tragedies within the Hawthorne family. In one instance, Sarah opened the parlor door to find a recreation of a dinner party from the 1800s, where the family members were frozen mid-motion, their eyes lifeless yet aware, as if trapped in a moment of eternal suffering. Shadows flitted across the walls, whispering incoherent words, sometimes repeating phrases Emily and Joshua had spoken moments before. One night, the Fletchers discovered a hidden passage behind the library fireplace. It was narrow and dark, leading to a lower chamber beneath the manor. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of old decay. The walls were covered in symbols identical to those in the attic, but far more numerous, forming patterns that seemed to pulse subtly, as if alive. Candles long extinguished had left blackened wax trails across the stone floor. As Mark traced his fingers along the etchings, he felt a jolt of cold pass through his arm, and the shadows in the room condensed into the forms of several figures, all staring at him silently. Dr. Weaver, who had been recording the expedition, captured audio of faint chanting and footsteps, despite no one else being present in the chamber. The children insisted that the chamber was the heart of the house, a place where the Shadow Man was strongest. Emily claimed that Alina had been trying to trap the entity here but had failed, leaving it free to torment all who entered. The family realized that the manor's intelligence was concentrated here, a sentient epicenter that thrived on fear, feeding off their terror, and using it to expand its influence. As days passed, the manifestations grew more aggressive. Furniture flew through hallways at high speed, mirrors reflected images of previous Hawthorne family members, and faint figures appeared at windows even during daylight. Sarah began recording these events meticulously, believing documentation might be their only protection. She noted that the manor seemed to respond to emotional states. Fear made the hauntings stronger, courage sometimes weakened them, and hesitation was punished with sudden violent episodes. Mark attempted to perform a counter-ritual using instructions gleaned from Alina's journals. The ritual required a specific arrangement of objects, candles, and incantations written in archaic language. As he began, shadows gathered densely around the room, forming figures that mimicked his movements mockingly. A heavy presence pressed on his chest, almost preventing him from completing the ritual. The children watched silently, speaking to unseen entities and directing them to allow the ritual to proceed. Slowly, with Emily and Joshua's guidance, Mark completed the ritual. The shadows receded momentarily, as if the house had paused to assess the result. However, the reprieve was temporary. The manor had grown stronger with each intrusion into its secrets. It retaliated with greater intensity the following night. The parlor, the kitchen, and the hallway became zones of extreme activity. Objects levitated, walls seemed to warp, and the shadow man appeared to stand in multiple locations simultaneously. The house seemed to be testing the family, pushing them to their limits psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. Through careful observation, the Fletchers realized that the manor had rules. It did not attack randomly. It was strategic, intelligent, and patient. It fed on fear but respected acts of bravery, subtle understanding, and attempts to honor its history. They learned to navigate hallways carefully, avoid certain rooms at specific times, and engage with the spirits in ways that temporarily pacified the entities. Yet every night, the house tested them anew, and each encounter left them weaker and more dependent on one another for survival. The night had fallen earlier than usual, cloaking Hawthorne Manor in a suffocating darkness. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows, lightning briefly illuminating the twisted, overgrown gardens. The Fletcher family knew that this night would be different. The house had sensed their intrusion into its deepest secrets and had prepared for a confrontation that would decide whether they could leave or become part of the manor itself. As they gathered in the parlor, the air turned unnaturally cold. Candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The children, Emily and Joshua, clutched each other tightly. Emily's eyes, normally bright with curiosity, were wide and haunted, reflecting shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. Joshua whispered instructions to unseen entities, his small voice commanding the air around him. The shadow man appeared first, a looming figure at the end of the hallway, its hollow eyes fixed upon the family, radiating malice and anticipation. Objects began to levitate immediately. Chairs, books, and even small tables spun through the room, propelled by unseen hands. The piano in the corner began playing by itself, striking discordant notes in a chaotic melody that filled every corner of the house. Eleanor Hawthorne's ghost manifested fully, her face pale and twisted with grief and fury. She moved silently through the room, her eyes alternately pleading and warning. The house was alive, sentient, and unwilling to release those who dared disturb its order. Mark and Sarah held the children close, trying to maintain focus amidst the chaos. Using the instructions from Eleanor's journals, Mark began the ritual to appease the spirits and weaken the house's hold. Candles were placed around symbols traced carefully on the floor, each one representing a binding or protective incantation. Emily recited phrases from the journal alongside him, her voice trembling yet precise. Joshua directed the shadows subtly, negotiating their passage through the house, ensuring that no entity was left unchecked. The manor reacted violently. Walls seemed to pulse and warp as if breathing. Shadows elongated and attacked the ritual markings, attempting to disrupt the fragile protective circle. The shadow man moved closer, its form twisting unnaturally, reaching toward Mark and Emily. Eleanor appeared between them and the entity, her spectral hand raised as though trying to contain the darkness. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of decades of pain, anger, and trapped souls. Mark continued the ritual, reciting the final passages aloud despite the oppressive force pressing against his chest. The candles flared violently, then dimmed. The shadows surged forward, then recoiled suddenly, as though restrained by an invisible barrier. Eleanor's ghost let out a mournful wail, a sound that resonated deep in the bones of everyone present, and the shadow man recoiled, screaming silently in fury. The room shook violently, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed the house itself might collapse around them. Emily and Joshua, guided by instinct and fear, completed the final phrases of the ritual simultaneously. A bright light erupted from the symbols on the floor, enveloping the room in a brilliant, blinding glow. The shadow man screamed, twisting and contorting before dissipating entirely into nothingness. Eleanor's figure, once angry and tormented, softened. She looked at the family with gratitude, her hollow eyes now filled with a faint, fleeting peace. Slowly she vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender and old parchment. The storm outside began to subside. The air returned to normal temperature, and the house, though still old and imposing, seemed inert, its oppressive sentience quelled, at least for now. The Fletcher family, exhausted and traumatized, realized that their ordeal had ended. They packed hastily and left Hawthorne Manor, driving without pause until the distant lights of a nearby town offered the first sense of safety they had felt in weeks. The Fletchers never returned. Hawthorne Manor remains abandoned, its windows darkened, its secrets intact. Locals report strange lights and sounds from within, though no one dares enter. Emily and Joshua carry the memory of the house, their innocence marked by experiences no child should endure. Sarah and Mark, though relocated, remain haunted by nightmares and the lingering sense of eyes watching them from beyond the veil of ordinary life. Hawthorne Manor endures as a monument to its own dark legacy, a sentient, malevolent presence bound by rituals, haunted by the tragedies of centuries, and aware that new families may one day wander through its halls. And if you ever happen to pass by the manor on a stormy October night, some claim you may see a pale figure in the window, her hollow eyes watching, waiting, silently warning you to leave before the house decides that you too belong within its walls. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to our channel.